my job is to really introduce absolutely wonderful speaker, Ellen Goodman. And I have to say, one of the great joys of this role is having the opportunity along the way to meet and introduce people that I've been fans of for a long time. And just in the last 2 months, having been a fan of Oliver Sacks all these years, we welcomed him to speak at Convocation a week ago Monday. There we were introducing Stephen Hawking, and you think, when you're a fan and then suddenly you have an opportunity to introduce someone, it's sort of trite to say that that our keynote speaker today needs no introduction. But if you read any of more than 450 newspapers, you already know her. Because Ellen Goodman's Pulitzer Prize-winning commentary appears in that many newspapers, and she's been a syndicated columnist since 1967. I see in my notes that in her intro it says that she is widely acclaimed as a voice of sanity, which as a psychiatrist I am authorized to actually declare here publicly and officially, Ellen. Ms. Goodman virtually broke the mold of the predominantly male editorial writers and has won wide readership by revealing certain kinds of universal truths that underlie current events. Among her many books are 5 collections of her columns, each of which is, I just think, a touchstone of her intelligence, her wit, and her style. Ms. Goodman is no stranger to university campuses. She's a cum laude graduate of Radcliffe College and has been a fellow at Harvard. She taught opinion writing at Stanford, and she is going to address us and then take questions from the audience when she's done. Also has a time factor like the mayor, but we're so glad that she is able to be with us and help us celebrate the grand opening of our Center for Women. It's a pleasure to have her as our guest at the university, and please join me in welcoming Ellen Goodman.
Thank you. I've gotten many academic credentials, but I've never been officially dubbed sane. But we haven't met each other very long. So I must tell you that whenever I'm introduced, I think of my own favorite credentialing story, and this happened to me the morning after I won the Pulitzer. I opened up the New York Times, and in the Times they had all these little pictures of us, and under my picture it said that I had graduated from Radcliffe from college, summa cum laude, and I thought it was very nice of the New York Times to give me a summa since Radcliffe had actually neglected to. So I wrote a letter to the managing editor of the Times, thanking him very much for my summa, and he sent me a letter back saying, "Oh, it is our pleasure. You are now the first person in American history to have won a Pulitzer and a summa on the same day." So all of you who are, if there are any undergraduates here who are waiting for grade inflation, take heart. You always have a chance. In any case, with this rather dubious academic credential, I tried to figure out why I was invited to speak at this wonderful opening of this university, and I guess I figured that I am here as an emissary of change. Every journalist is that. We're in the business of news, of chronicling what is new in our society. And the piece of news that I have been most intrigued with throughout my life have been the changes in our private and public relationships. I've written most consistently about the single major social change of my lifetime, which has been the women's movement. And I like to think of the women's movement literally as the movement of women from one life pattern to many, and of course the movement of women especially into the workforce. Every one of us here has been a part of that. Our lives, the way we think about ourselves and our world have all been changed by that. And as a journalist, I have chronicled this, but as a woman, I have obviously also been a part of it. To me, for example, it's remarkable how much the attitudes towards working mothers have changed in the years since I first became one. And I should tell you just a little bit about my own history in that regard. I, too, became a mother in the usual way. And I decided to stay at home in order to get my daughter off to a good start in life. So I didn't go back to work until she was 6 weeks old. So at that time, however, I was the only working mother of a preschool child in the city room, and I remember very well the attitude of some of my colleagues when I first came back to work. They would stop me in the hall and say, "And who takes care of your child?" And about the 18th time this happened to me, I turned around and said, "Oh, I just leave her at home with the refrigerator open, and it all works out." Well, obviously, things have changed a great deal since then. So many of the mothers of preschool children are indeed working, and only 7% of the families in this country are what we often persist in thinking of as the traditional American family with a husband breadwinner, a wife homemaker, and 2 small children. Well, what has happened in all of this is that the people who were once indeed critical are now questioning. How's it working? How far are we? Is this where we meant to be? And are we, in fact, stuck here? In short, I think it's time for us to conceive of the next stage, the next movement in this movement. It seems to me that we are at another one of those pivotal moments in our own country's history, and I have promised to try and make some sense of this. But let me go back a little bit for a brief survey course on the Women's Movement 101, particularly since that movement takes place over the entire course at which you were trying to establish this Women's Center, so we can go through that history at the same time. About 30 years ago, when people first started thinking about this center, the social change that we call the women's movement first really hit society, and in many ways threatened to divide America into 2 camps, really into 2 extremes. At one extreme were the radical feminists, the ones who called for a great leap into the future, and among them were a few women who either appeared to be or who explicitly were anti-family and anti-children. And on the other hand, the right hand, you will notice, were the group that I can only think of as the radical reactionaries. My favorite radical reactionary of the time was a wonderful woman called Helen Andelin, who wrote a book called The Fascinating Female that recommended, among other useful things, getting women off the highways. My favorite quote from her book is when she said, "When you are angry at your husband, stamp your feet and beat upon his chest. Men love this." It actually never worked for me. Well, in some way, these 2 extremists presented the rest of America with a conflict between thinking we had to go back to a very traditional family or move on to no family at all. And for most of us, these choices were neither possible nor palatable. They were, in fact, kind of scary. So this argument that went on between the 2 extremes in American society also went on inside an awful lot of our heads. But gradually, Americans voted with their feet and with their lives. We now have both the necessity to achieve in the world and the desire not to jettison our family lives. We have the desire to keep the best of the traditional and get the best of the non-traditional. In a strange way, in this new millennium, Americans are still trying to change conservatively. In other words, we are trying to change while conserving those things, relationships, ideals, commitments, which mean the most to us. Increasingly, American women want access to the best of what were once the old male roles. We want equality, but not necessarily on male terms. And we don't want to lose the best of the old female roles. One way to think about the past decades of change during which you were trying to get to the center is to look at the social ideals or the mythologies by which we often judge our own lives and how those changed in this time. And perhaps the starkest example of those mythological changes, one I've chronicled for a long time, which is the change from the myth of Supermom to the myth of Superwoman. Now, Supermom, I don't know how many of you were one or had one, but you know, she was the woman who always sent her children to school with pumpkin-shaped sandwiches and raisin eyes, carrot teeth. And her children always had homemade Halloween costumes. She always had something loving in the oven. She was always nurturing, always caring, always available. She was the woman that my generation carried around in our heads just for the guilt of it. Well, at some time during this period, we exchanged her for a model called Superwoman. And for many years, I have tried to describe Superwoman as she is, alas, still offered to all of us as a viable role model. And the best that I have been able to do is to describe a day in the life of Superwoman as she is so often presented by the media. Superwoman gets up in the morning and wakes her 2.3 children. She then goes downstairs where she feeds them a grade A nutritional breakfast, which they eat. Her children then go off to school for getting nothing. And she goes upstairs and gets into her $1,200 Armani suit and goes off to her $100,000 a year job, doing work which is creative but socially useful. After work, and of course her 6-mile run, she goes home to spend a wonderful hour interacting with the children, because haven't we all been told, it isn't the quantity of time, it's the quality of time. After that hour, she goes into the kitchen where she follows some Martha Stewart recipe for dinner. The family then sits around the dining room table discussing the checks and balances of the United States government system. Her children then go to sleep, and she and her husband have time for their meaningful relationship, after which they too go to bed, where she is multi-orgasmic until midnight. Tomorrow is another day, you know. There also emerged in this era a new Superman. I will spare you his day. Let us just say that the new improved Superman is now required to be open, caring, supportive, able to leap tall emotional boundaries while becoming vice president of Microsoft. Well, what happened in both of these messages as they evolved, these myths, was that there was obviously a lot of guilt. Even today, women are supposed to be guilty if they are now not working, and also if they are not supermoms. Men are supposed to be guilty if they are not feeling and achieving and attending their children's school plays. We have attempted to make change without experiencing loss by adding one set of expectations on top of another. But if Superwoman became our new approved model, it was because she was the woman who changed without upsetting society and without upsetting men. Superwoman was the socially useful myth that women could have it all as long as they could do it all. Well, in the current psychology, it is now very popular to say that the women's movement went too far. But it seems to me that American women have not been the victims of too much social change, but of too little. And for a long time, we've been stuck. The women's movement always traveled on two legs. With one leg, we were to kick down the doors that were closed to us, but with the other leg, we were going to walk through those doors, transforming society for men and for women. It turned out that it was a lot easier to kick down those doors than to transform society. So we have been dragging that second leg behind, limping through the lopsidedness of social change. We all know that change has been lopsided, at least at some level. More women took on the old male roles than men took on the old female roles. We got more equal responsibilities than equal rights. This is not exactly a news bulletin. There are lots of reasons why change was lopsided. Some women simply took on the double burden to maintain the illusion that they always had a choice. Other women accepted the responsibility for change itself. If they were at home for 5 or 10 years and went back into the workforce, they thought it was their responsibility to make sure that no one else suffered. Change has also been lopsided because obviously there are so many single mothers who have no choice but to do it all and be it all. Because I am something of an economic determinist, I would also say that change has been lopsided because women still earn 77 cents for every male dollar. And as long as they are paid less in the workforce, many attempt to balance that in their relationships by actually doing more at home. In other words, they get it twice. Paid less for their work outside the home, they make a psychological calculation that they have to do more to make a equal contribution in the home. And also, of course, change has been lopsided because we have had trouble convincing men of the intrinsic joy of housework. But I think in a way that all of you will understand, change has been lopsided because women have had more success at getting into the male world than at changing that world. It's been easier, although not easy, to get equal status in a male job than to get equal status for a female job category, nurse, teacher, social worker. It's been easier to create a mommy track at a corporation or a firm than to get the corporation off its original track. To put it simply, American women have had much more success in adapting not only to male life patterns, but in adapting to what were traditional male values than in getting men to adapt to traditionally female values. It's been much easier to win equal access to the values of achievement, power, success, competition, than to win equal time for the values of caregiving, nurturing, cooperation. I've seen that, and most of you have seen it as well. It's certainly a primary reason why the room at the top is primarily occupied by, for example, men with wives at home or single women. My mother's generation was kept out of the professions, kept out of the top jobs. My generation has opened a lot of those doors through sacrifice and hard work. Now young educated women can make it, but it is still a man's world in terms of the standards and values. And we now recognize that there are limits to the kind of success you can dress for. I think in thinking about leadership, in thinking about women's power, I think that we have to think about the fact that what was for decades thought of as a conflict between men and women, and then a conflict between male roles and female roles, now feels to Americans like a conflict in values. American society has always had a tension between two sets of values, the values of individualism and those of community, the I and the we, the desire, the expectation, the pressure for every American to make it, pull herself up by her own bootstraps, make it entirely on her own, and at the same time, the recognition that life only has meaning when it's shared with others. Well, in American history, we originally solved the tension between these two sets of values by divvying them up. Women maintained the values of caregiving and nurturing. Men had those of worldly kinds of individual achievement. Women were the keepers of community and family. We did the upkeep on relationships, on connections, while men kept the public power and the role of individuals. During the past generation of change, however, women have quite properly thought about their own lives as individuals. At the same time, women continued to do the majority of the caregiving that is still done in society, but the net amount of caregiving in our society has decreased. Caregiving of children, caregiving of parents, and caregiving of communities. Now, in fact, that women are joining men in quest for worldly kinds of achievements, we can no longer hide a fundamental split in our national psyche. We have a need for caregiving as well as other kinds of achievement. We have a need for people who are attentive to community as well as to themselves. I think this conflict is felt by everyone, but sometimes I think it is felt particularly acutely by women, because we still stand at the intersection of this transitional time, balancing work and family, the values of individualism and those of community. It's not surprising that we take this to heart, because we are making different and hard decisions and often feel defensive about them. Well, there are risks in any period of social change, and I think the risk for us, and the risk particularly for the new generation, is that we could actually stay stuck at this moment when change is so uneven. We have gone from the year of the woman in 1992 to the year of the angry white man in 1994 to the year of the soccer mom to the year of the pregnant Chad, without coming any closer to solving our fundamental problems. Consider for a minute what has happened in the ongoing debates about welfare reform. In many ways, Democrats and Republicans, Senate and Congress, the left and the right in this country, arrived at a consensus so fundamentally radical for our history that it's barely acknowledged. And it's a consensus that says a mother's place is in the workforce, a poor mother's place. Over half a century ago, the AFDC program was deliberately set out to enable widowed mothers to stay at home with their children, in fact, to keep women out of the workforce and in home with their children. But now there is literally no support for poor women to take care of their children. Indeed, mothers struggling the hardest at the lowest paying jobs are understandably the least supportive at paying for other mothers to stay at home. So it strikes me that we arrived at a time when we have two conflicting images of the good mother in our society. On the one side of the tracks, the maternal role model of the moment is a kind of high-powered professional woman who chucks it all to be at home with the children. And on the other side of the tracks, the role model of the moment is a welfare mother who leaves her children for the workforce. There is no child care good enough to justify the working mother staying in the CEO's office, and there is no child care bad enough to justify the welfare mother staying at home. We have come all the way through this change that I have been describing, this change in attitudes towards mothering, without answering the question that was raised at the very beginning of this social change: who will take care of the children? Who will take care of communities? So in this movement, we are only halfway there. We have begun opening the door to women, but we haven't opened it more than a crack for our values. We don't have it all. I don't myself think that American women can ever achieve equality in our own terms until we have achieved equality for the values that we were assigned and have held high. We want to make it, but not just for ourselves. And until we solve those problems, we won't be able to take the next steps toward power. And until we achieve more power, we probably won't be able to solve the problems. That's our conundrum in this double helix of social change. And this is very much related to my sense that we need to get some movement back into the movement. Well, the most obvious source of help is from the men in our lives, and there is also a growing level of conflict and evidence that American men are thinking about their lives in new ways. Many, as they marry and work and form families, and conflicted in ways that are entirely familiar to women. How do they allot time for work, for life, for themselves? Many men are also halfway through a difficult internal changes which mirror the external changes that women's lives have been through. American men have swung from seeing John Wayne as some kind of role model to seeing Alan Alda as some kind of role model to seeing something halfway between Colin Powell and Bruce Springsteen. A kind of muscular sensitivity. If American women are trying to balance work and family in the outside world, American men are trying to balance strength and sensitivity in the internal world to be strong but not silent. Well, sometime during the last decade, a men's movement emerged and hit the popular culture and imagination, you will remember. The good news for women is that men were beginning to talk to each other. The bad news was that they were looking for their roots in drumbeats and tribal rights, which sounded an awful lot like football and fraternity parties. The next movement in the men's movement were the Promise Keepers, and they promised what? A kinder, gentler patriarchy. So there's been, until quite recently, also an imbalance between the young men and women of university ages. Young women talk about balancing work and family. They're encouraged by their teachers, they're encouraged by their mothers, they're encouraged by their families to think about how they're going to plan their lives. But they are often reluctant to talk about these things with the men in their lives until it is too late. In some places, young women who want to break through a kind of conspiracy of silence are still scared off by the fact that they could be rejected by men. This is an old warning that keeps resurfacing. Not long ago, you may remember the blown-up reports about a study that showed that a college graduate over 30 had only a 20% chance of marriage, and by 40 she had, and I quote, a better chance of being blown up by a terrorist. A very curious analogy. Well, many anxiety attacks later, these statistics were debunked, but the hostile message survived, and that is an old message that uppity women end up alone. I, by the way, prefer the saying of a friend of mine, the mother of 4 daughters, who tells her daughters, speak up, the only man you will scare off is your future ex-husband. Today, young men and women do indeed have more equal relationships until they have children, and the lack of support still sends many to the sides of a divide that they neither believe in nor want. Perhaps the prenuptial agreement should be a prenatal agreement. I'm afraid that in this mixed progress report, there is also a kind of subtle backlash among women who are essentially encouraged to give up on the possibility that men can change. Books like The Surrendered Wife, Past the Fascinating Female, and we have also had a lot of conversation on a cultural divide in which men and women stand on either side, one from Mars, one from Venus, yelling at each other. What then of our second category of helpers, society? This is changing even more slowly, I'm afraid. We are at a stage now where women no longer are the secondary workers, providing a buffer, a bit of flexibility, college tuition, whatever. Families need 2 incomes to survive now. Indeed, many feel more fragile in a kind of downsizing economy. Yet today, women are limping through the lopsidedness of change, struggling to get ahead in a system while at the same time questioning it. We want to be accepted as one of the boys, and we want to change the way the boys operate. We want to achieve as individuals and as members of a community. But at the same time, it seems to me American women are often settling for too little. We don't seem to have an agenda. And as voters and citizens, we are suffering for what I often think of as terminal gratitude, a peculiarly female disease. Eleanor Roosevelt once looked at the power of the vote. And she said, "I think sometimes that women have used their vote as a child uses his first garden. He sows it with great care, but instead of watering them or giving them great care and attention, he forgets watering them or else digs them up to see how they are doing." Now, I hate to add something else to Superwoman's daily agenda, social activism. My daughter is now at the age I was when this first movement first hit. I have just become a grandmother, and all of this has made me feel even more strongly that we have to stop limping. If the changes that we need to right the lopsidedness of change come, I think it will be from the growth of another set of raised expectations that I see here. To make the movement move again, the energy is going to come from people like you and from the young women who come to your center, people who live inside this expectations gap, sharing more common ground and, I think, more common frustrations than we are all sometimes willing to express. Some are young mothers, daughters of feminism, who expected to stay on the fast track and left because their firms and companies expected 70-hour weeks. Some are women in their 20s who grew up assuming independence, only to find their freedom limited not by "no women need apply" signs, but by a fear of violence. And there are women, too, who look in vain for a skirt among the suits at an international hearing or conference, and sometimes find one. There are women who made it into the inner circle of businesses only to become conscious of how hard it is to make a difference in that circle, and they are women as well who are angered by an image on MTV, turned off by a blonde joke, pissed off, and exhausted by the sheer tenacity of the way things are. And they are the men who share the perspective and lives of these women. I do think this is the right moment for women to grab the high ground and to grab hold of the language of American values. Since September 11th, we've been reminded in the most dramatic ways possible of how women's rights are fundamentally American. After all, those women in Afghanistan had literally no public face, no public voice. Under the Taliban, working was illegal, but so was laughing out loud. The female half of the population was under house arrest. It's not a coincidence either that the highest maternal death rate in the world was in Afghanistan under the Taliban. In the aftermath of terrorism, even the Bush administration declared that the emancipation of women was what made the fight worthwhile. He declared that the way we treat women makes us different from the Taliban, that the enemies of American values take their first shots at the freedom of women. We've got to remind him of this. But every citizen can literally see that freedom, women's rights, women's voices are mainstream American values. What we need is to keep our sights on an agenda that puts the pieces of our lives together, that balances individualism and community and rights this lopsidedness. It includes keeping the rights that we have won over the last decades, no small task, but it doesn't stop there. We need to expand family policies in the workplace and in Washington to help families really catch up to the society. And underlying all of this, we must insist that women be heard, that our voices and our life experiences count at last in all the places where our future is decided. The long-term reality is indeed that our private lives depend on public life, that we have to move beyond this era of lopsided change into a world in which men and women's values are more balanced. This is the challenge of the next generation who will be meeting in your center and meeting all around with us. It's a tall order, but I think every bit as exciting in its possibilities as the onset of the women's movement was 30 years ago. The question during all of this time was always, can we have it all? And the answer in the new millennium is no. But with some help, we can have a pretty rich sampling. In closing, I can only say that what I have learned is that change, real deep substantive social change, takes a long time. And maybe the best motto for the center comes from the Beat Generation poet, Jack Kerouac, who said way back in the 1950s, walking on water wasn't built in a day. Thank you. I know we're running late, but I promised to take a question, so if you have one or two, I think I promised to come in on time and space, and we are running late, but go ahead. Yes.
I'm going to start here. You touched upon so many important issues in terms of the conflicts in society and the fact that we need to work for social change. Could you perhaps speak to what issues you think would be most important for people to work on? Students come to me a lot and say, well, I want to work on behalf of women. You know, what's most important? And of course, there's no one what's most important, but I was wondering if you're thinking.
The question of sort of where do you start? What's most important, you know, which of the issue? I don't myself think you can pick one out of a hat, you know, although I think with an election coming up, the issue of politics is very strong to get both more women and more women-friendly politicians running, and to also be tougher, and to, you know, everybody's a one-issue voter except women, you know. To have a list of non-negotiable, to hold people to the fire the way other interest groups do. But beyond that, I think people work in the areas that they do. You know, I know how people work in small and large ways. Some people work at their workplace. Some people mentor. Some people make changes in the schools their kids are in. I think it's such a social change movement is not a 10-point program. And, you know, I've known people who have worked on issues of aging in as simple ways as declaring their age at all times, you know. I'm 62 and, you know, this can be a fairly radical statement to people. So I think that at the same time, I also think that we have some real challenges in saving reproductive rights. That's going to be a huge issue right now. So, pick what it is that is important to where you are, and then also come together as a group and encourage, I think, the younger generation, which tends to not be collaborative and not think in terms of movements, but think in terms of individual actions. Get that collectivity moving again, so we don't feel alone again. Yes.
Welcome to the Feminist Grandmothers group. And in that vein, you know, I'm discovering with 6 kids of my own and 8 grandchildren that whatever I miss doing for my children, I am expected again to do for grandchildren. And that is particularly true for the children of my daughters. And I feel that need to do that because of all of what you've mentioned. And that may be a challenge, but it's also an opportunity in terms of what we can do next with what's left of a much longer and hopefully much healthier life.
That's fine, and I hope that we don't have to do it alone the way we thought we had to do it alone as mothers. Maybe you need a grandmother collective. In Boston, there was this wonderful thing in the 19th century where there was a housekeeping collective, and a group of women in Cambridge actually cleaned each other's houses. Now, of course, we would want it to be a co-ed collectivity, but I think, again, to collective action so that our daughters don't, again, feel that they are alone taking care of it, and that it isn't just, your only choices aren't your mother, the child's grandmother, and we need to keep this being a much larger community issue. So thank you very much.
A moment of silence for this great moment. In dedicating our center, we carry hopes and dreams of many. May this center be a place of welcome, respect, and comfort, listening and learning. May the center grow in collective, multicultural wisdom. We hope to have laughter, smiles, and when necessary, tears. Let us look to the future and honor and remember our past. We are pleased to dedicate the Center for Women at Case Western Reserve University in gratitude to all who brought us to this day and in great celebration of the center's future. Hear, hear!